Welcome, listener, to a journey through the twisted tapestry of Dead by Daylight. As you settle into comfort, let us explore together the vast, interconnected web of stories that span centuries, dimensions, and the very fabric of reality itself. This is a tale of an ancient, unknowable force, of countless souls drawn into an eternal game, and of the thin line between hunter and hunted. At the center of all things in this dark universe exists a being beyond comprehension. It has no true name that human tongues can speak, no form that mortal eyes can fully perceive. It is simply known as the entity. Some scholars of the fog have theorized it is as old as human fear itself, perhaps older. It exists outside of time, outside of space as we understand it, in a realm of its own creation, fed by the most primal of emotions. The entity is not malevolent in the way we typically understand evil. It does not hate, it does not love. It simply is, and it hungers. What sustains this incomprehensible being is the raw, distilled essence of hope struggling against despair. The exquisite moment when a survivor clings to the possibility of escape even as darkness closes in around them. This is the delicate flavor the entity savors, the emotional spectrum between terror and determination that nourishes its vast, unfathomable existence. To feed this endless hunger, the entity has constructed a realm, a pocket dimension existing parallel to our own reality, yet separated by an impenetrable veil of fog. Within this realm, it orchestrates what it calls trials, endless games of survival, where those it has claimed are forced to participate in a macabre dance of death and temporary salvation. 4 survivors must repair generators to power exit gates, while a single killer hunts them through nightmarish realms, pulled from the darkest moments of human history and imagination. The fog that permeates everything in this realm is the entity's presence made manifest. It curls and writhes with a life of its own, responding to the emotions of those trapped within it. When a survivor is hooked upon the entity's sacrificial implements, great spider-like appendages descend from above, patient and inevitable, ready to pull the offering into its unknowable depths. These same manifestations appear to block windows and doorways, to deny the killer its prey when the game's delicate balance tips too far in one direction. Time has no meaning in the entity's realm. A survivor might experience what feels like years of trials, yet their body does not age, does not permanently break. They are restored after each death, their memories of pain vivid but their flesh unmarred, ready to run again. The killers, too, are locked in this timeless state, driven by compulsions both familiar and foreign, instruments of the entity's will whether they embrace their role or rail against it. Before we delve into the individual stories of those trapped in this eternal game, we must understand that the entity is selective in whom it claims. It does not simply snatch random souls from the living world. It watches, it waits, and it chooses. It is drawn to those who have known great trauma, great passion, or great darkness. Survivors often come from moments of extreme crisis, plucked from the very precipice of death or despair. Killers are selected for their capacity for violence, their connection to death, or their potential to inspire the terror that makes the hunt so deliciously sustaining. The entity's realm is composed of various domains, each one a twisted reflection of places significant to its inhabitants. These realms are both prison and hunting ground, familiar enough to instill a false sense of hope in the survivors, alien enough to keep them perpetually off balance. an abandoned Autohaven junkyard, a cursed cornfield, a rotting swamp, ancient temple ruins, a cold and silent mountain resort. Each location has been pulled from reality and reshaped by the entity's presence into something other. Now, as we begin our chronological journey through the stories that feed the entity, let us start not at the beginning of time, for the entity's beginning is unknown and perhaps unknowable, but at the earliest points in human history, where its influence has been recorded, where the first souls were claimed for the fog. Part 1. The Ancient Ones. Our story truly begins in ancient times, in an era when humanity still lived in the shadow of forces it could not understand or control. Thousands of years before the modern age, before nations and empires, there existed cultures that worshipped powers we can only glimpse through fragments and artifacts. It is here, in the depths of antiquity, that we encounter our first killer. The plague, whose true name was Adiris, lived in ancient Babylon during a time of great faith and greater suffering. She was born into a society where the priesthood held immense power, where the favor of the gods could elevate one from poverty to prominence. Adiris was a true believer, devoted to the Babylonian pantheon with every fiber of her being. Her piety was noted from childhood, and as she grew, so too did her reputation as one who could speak to the divine. Adiris was beautiful, charismatic, and utterly dedicated to her role as a priestess. The people flocked to her, seeking blessings, guidance, and intercession with the gods. She lived in the grand temple complex, surrounded by other devoted servants, and she believed with perfect certainty that the gods heard her prayers and valued her service. She never questioned her faith, never doubted the righteousness of her path. Then the sickness came. It started small, as these things often do. A few worshippers fell ill, their bodies covered in weeping sores, their breath becoming labored. Despite the priest's prayers and rituals, the afflicted did not recover. They grew worse, their bodies betraying them in the most grotesque ways. The disease spread, creeping through the lower city, like a dark tide. Still, the temple remained pure, protected by the god's favor, or so the priesthood believed. Adiris threw herself into prayer with renewed fervor. She led elaborate ceremonies, made countless offerings, and petitioned the gods day and night to spare her people. And then, one morning, she noticed the first signs upon her own skin. A small lesion, easily hidden beneath her ceremonial robes. She told no one. She prayed harder, certain that her devotion would see her through, that the gods would not allow their most faithful servant to succumb to such a common plague. But the gods, if they existed as she believed them to, did not answer. The disease progressed, spreading across her body with relentless cruelty. Still, she hid it, maintaining her duties even as her body began to fail. She could not let the people know. She could not let them lose faith. And perhaps, in some deep corner of her mind, she could not accept that she had been abandoned by the very deities she had served so faithfully. When the truth could no longer be concealed, when the sores covered her face and hands, when her very presence marked her as diseased, the other priests turned on her with shocking swiftness. She was cast out from the temple, deemed unclean, her faith suddenly meaningless in the face of her affliction. The people who had once revered her now fled from her approach, throwing stones to drive her away from the city. Adiris retreated to the temple ruins outside the city, a place long abandoned and half swallowed by the earth. There, alone and dying, her body racked with pain and fever, she made one final, desperate prayer. She begged for understanding, for meaning, for some sign that her suffering had purpose. And in that moment of absolute desperation and shattered faith, the entity heard her. The fog came gently at first, almost comforting in its cool embrace. Adiris, in her delirium, believed it to be the presence of the divine at last responding to her devotion. As the entity claimed her, it did not cure her disease. Instead, it transformed it into something else, something that could be used. Her sickness became a weapon, her touch a vector of corruption. The entity whispered to her, and in her broken state, she interpreted its voice as the gods she had always served. In the entity's realm, Adiris remains the plague, forever diseased, forever devout, believing herself to be enacting divine will as she hunts survivors through the ruins of what resembles her lost temple. She vomits corruption upon her prey, spreading her sickness, and when they are infected, when they become broken and ill, she can commune with what she believes to be her goddess, gaining the power to strike them down from a distance. The entity is clever in how it uses its instruments, letting them believe what they need to believe to serve effectively. Moving forward through the centuries, we come to a time of clashing faiths and brutal warfare. During the Heian period of Japan, roughly 1,000 years ago, a young woman named Rin Yamaoka existed, though her story truly begins much later. However, her ancestor, a samurai of fearsome reputation, lived during this era of constant conflict. This warrior's spirit and the legacy of violence he created would echo through the centuries, eventually manifesting in Rin herself when she became the spirit. But before we reach Rin's time, we must speak of another entity tied to ancient traditions. The Oni, whose mortal name was Kazan Yamaoka, was Rin's ancestor, a samurai who lived during the age of warring states in Japan. Kazan was born into a time of incredible violence and upheaval, when feudal lords constantly warred for territory and power. He was trained from childhood in the ways of the warrior, taught that honor and strength were the highest virtues. Kazan was exceptional even among his fellow samurai. He was larger, stronger, and more skilled than most men. But what truly set him apart was his rage. He possessed a terrible fury that, once unleashed, could not be easily contained. In battle, this rage made him nearly unstoppable. He would wade into enemy lines like a demon, his blade cutting down all who stood before him. His fellow samurai called him Oni Yamaoka, the demon, and the name was not spoken with affection, but with a mixture of respect and fear. Despite his prowess in battle, or perhaps because of it, Kazan struggled to find his place in a society that valued not only strength, but also honor, composure, and loyalty to one's lord. His rage, while useful in war, made him unpredictable. He was passed over for positions of greater authority, kept as a weapon to be used rather than a leader to be followed. This fueled his anger further, creating a cycle of violence and resentment. As Japan moved toward unification, as the great lords consolidated power and the constant warfare began to slow, warriors like Kazan found their purpose diminishing. The age of the samurai was changing, and those who lived only for battle struggled to adapt. Kazan could not. He existed in a state of constant, simmering fury, seeking out fights, manufacturing conflicts to have something to unleash his rage upon. One day, after being publicly humiliated by a superior who questioned his honor and self-control, Kazan's rage finally consumed him entirely. In a fit of uncontrollable violence, he slaughtered not only his detractor, but numerous others who attempted to stop him. Blood-soaked and beyond reason, he fled into the mountains, hunted by those who had once called him comrade. He took refuge in a sanctum in the mountains, a place associated with Oni, the demons of Japanese folklore. There, alone and wounded, his rage still burning but his body failing, the entity found him. It did not come as fog this time, but as something that spoke to Kazan's nature. It came as a mask, ancient and terrible, calling to him with promises of eternal battle, endless opportunities to unleash his fury. Half dead and seeing hallucinations from blood loss and exhaustion, Kazan donned the mask. The transformation was immediate and horrifying. The rage that had always been part of him became something more, something supernatural. His body twisted and grew, becoming the demon that others had always called him. The entity had turned metaphor into reality, and Kazan, now truly the Oni, was pulled into the fog. There, he hunts with his massive blade, his rage building with each strike until he enters what is called blood fury, moving with impossible speed, his weapon able to cut down multiple survivors with a single sweep. The Yamaoka legacy, steeped in violence and rage, would continue through the centuries. The bloodline carried within it a certain resonance, an attunement to fury and vengeance that the entity found particularly appealing. This brings us closer to the modern era, but before we arrive there, we must travel to the American frontier, to a time of expansion and exploitation. Part 2. The American Nightmare. The 19th century in America was a time of tremendous change and violence. As settlers pushed westward, they encountered the existing peoples of the land, leading to conflict, disease, and displacement on a massive scale. It was also a time when people could disappear into the vast wilderness and never be found, when justice was often administered by gun and rope rather than law and court. In the latter half of the 1800s, in the American West, there lived a young man named Philip Ojomo. Actually, that's not quite right. Philip's story belongs to a later era. Let me correct myself. During this period, we encounter the huntress, whose name was Anna. Anna was born in the late 19th century in the cold forests of Russia, not America, as I mistakenly began to say. The Russian wilderness was vast and unforgiving, a place where nature still held dominion over humanity. Anna's mother was a recluse, living in a small cabin far from any village or town. She raised her daughter in isolation, teaching her to hunt, to survive, to respect the forest, and fear nothing within it. Anna's childhood was hard but not unhappy. She loved her mother deeply and took to the lessons of survival with natural aptitude. She could track game through the forest with ease, could throw her hunting hatchets with deadly accuracy, and knew the patterns of the seasons, the habits of animals, the locations of food and shelter. The forest was her entire world, and she was content with it. Then, during a hunt when Anna was still quite young, tragedy struck. Her mother was attacked by a great elk, its antlers goring her terribly. Anna, despite her skills, could only watch as her mother bled out in the snow, too far from any help, dying slowly while Anna held her hand and begged her not to leave. When her mother finally passed, Anna was alone in a way few people ever experience. She was not merely isolated, she was the only human being in her entire world. Anna did what she had been taught to do. She survived. She continued to hunt, to gather, to maintain the cabin. But loneliness ate at her like a cancer. She began to hear her mother's voice in the wind, to see her shape in the shadows. The isolation was breaking something in her mind, warping her sense of reality. One day, while hunting near the outskirts of civilization, Anna heard something she had not heard in years, the sound of children playing. She crept closer and saw a group of young girls from a nearby village, playing in a field while their mothers worked nearby. The sound of their laughter awakened something powerful in Anna, a desperate need for companionship, for family. She wanted, more than anything, to have a child of her own, someone to teach and raise as her mother had raised her. Anna began to take the girls. She would watch the villages, wait for a child to wander too far from safety, and then she would strike with the efficient brutality of a predator. She would carry her prize back to her cabin in the forest, humming lullabies her mother had once sung to her, believing in her fractured mind that she was saving these children, giving them the gift of the forest life she had known. But Anna had no understanding of how to care for children beyond what she knew of training and survival. She could not comprehend that young girls from villages needed warmth, proper food, gentle treatment. She trained them like she would train hunting dogs, expected them to adapt to the harsh forest life immediately. When they cried for their mothers, she would grow frustrated. When they fell ill from the cold and deprivation, she did not know how to help them. One by one, they all died, and one by one, Anna would return to the villages for more, her mind unable to process her failures, always believing the next child would be different, would be strong enough, would become the family she so desperately craved. The villagers began to tell stories of a monster in the woods, a demon that stole children. They called her the Huntress, and they feared to enter her forest. The entity, always watching for those whose existence generates the particular emotions it savors, took notice of Anna. Here was someone who combined lethal efficiency with tragic loneliness, whose actions created terror in others while stemming from a broken need for connection. The fog came for Anna one evening as she returned to her cabin after taking another child. The forest seemed to shift and change around her, becoming both familiar and alien. She did not fight it. In some ways, she welcomed it. In the entity's realm, Anna remains the huntress, forever carrying the hatchets she used to provide for herself and her mother. She still hums the lullabies, the sound drifting through the trials, unsettling in its childlike innocence. She hunts survivors with the same methodical patience she used for tracking elk and hunting village children. The entity allows her to believe she is protecting her territory, and perhaps, in her damaged mind, each survivor she catches is another child she can bring home. Now we truly do move to America, to the 20th century, where several of the entity's most notorious instruments originate. In the 1960s and 70s, America was undergoing tremendous social upheaval. The Vietnam War, civil rights movements, the counterculture revolution. It was a time of both hope and deep societal tension. It was also a golden age for a particular type of predator, the serial killer. In Texas, during this era, there existed a family. They ran a small farm and, to outward appearances, were simple, hard-working people trying to make a living off the land. But the Hewitt family, or as they're known in the entity's realm, the family associated with the cannibal, held dark secrets. Actually, let me be more precise. The cannibal's true origin is somewhat debated, but within the realm of the entity, he is Bubba Sawyer, though the historical details blur together. Bubba was born different. Whether due to genetics, environmental factors, or complications at birth, he was developmentally disabled, his mental capacity never developing beyond that of a child despite his large, strong body. His family was poor, living on the margins of society, and they dealt with Bubba's condition through isolation. He was kept on the family property, hidden from outsiders, treated sometimes with rough affection, and sometimes with cruel pragmatism. The family business had once been a slaughterhouse, processing meat for the local community. Bubba learned to work there, following simple instructions, his strength useful for the heavy labor involved. He learned to use a chainsaw to cut through bone and gristle, became comfortable with the smells and sights of butchery. To him, it was simply work, made bearable by his family's approval when he did well. When economic changes forced the slaughterhouse to close, the family fell on even harder times. Food became scarce, money ran out, and desperation set in. It was likely the older family members who first made the decision to cross the line between animal and human butchery. Perhaps it started with someone already dead, found on the road. Perhaps it was more deliberate than that. Regardless, the family began to view human beings as just another resource to be exploited. For Bubba, the change was not dramatic. He was told that the work was continuing, just with different meat. His moral compass, never fully developed and completely subsumed by his desire to please his family and avoid their anger, did not rebel. When he was told to chase down intruders, to bring them back to be processed, he did so. When he was given his chainsaw and told to stop people from leaving the property, he obeyed. The roar of the chainsaw, the familiarity of the work, was actually comforting to him. Bubba wore masks made from the faces of victims, a grotesque practice possibly started by other family members but adopted by him. These masks represented different aspects of his limited personality, different roles he was told to play. The pretty woman mask, the old lady mask, the killing mask. Each one a crude attempt to give structure to his fragmentary sense of self. The entity found the Sawyer property eventually, drawn by the concentrated terror and death that occurred there. It claimed not just Bubba, but the essence of that horrible family dynamic, the house itself, and the nightmare of being hunted by a childlike man with a chainsaw who cannot be reasoned with, who doesn't even understand the wrongness of what he does. In the entity's realm, Bubba is the cannibal, forever chasing survivors with his roaring chainsaw, able to cut down multiple victims in seconds when his tantrum is triggered. An eternal man-child serving an incomprehensible master instead of his earthly family. Around the same period, across the Atlantic in England, a different kind of horror was taking shape. In the early 1970s, a doctor named Carter ran a psychiatric institution, Laris Memorial Institute. On the surface, it was a place meant to help those suffering from mental illness, a facility where the disturbed could receive treatment and hopefully return to society as functioning individuals. In reality, it was a house of horrors. Herman Carter was not insane in the traditional sense. He was intelligent, educated, and fully aware of what he was doing. He simply lacked empathy, viewing his patients not as human beings, but as subjects for experimentation. He was fascinated by the human mind, particularly by how it could be broken, what methods could fragment a personality most effectively, how much psychological torture a person could endure before their sense of self completely shattered. Carter's experiments were nominally sanctioned by various government agencies interested in psychological warfare and interrogation techniques during the Cold War era. He received funding, equipment, and, most importantly, immunity from oversight. Lyris Memorial Institute became his personal laboratory, and the patients became his raw materials. He developed what he called electroconvulsive therapy, though it was torture by any honest name. He would subject patients to massive electrical shocks, not to help them, but to observe the effects on their minds. He kept meticulous notes on how long it took for someone to break completely, which methods produced which types of psychological dissolution, how to inflict maximum psychological damage while keeping the subject alive for further experimentation. The patients who survived Carter's treatments were left as hollow shells, their minds so thoroughly traumatized that they could barely function. Some became catatonic, others descended into violent psychosis. Carter observed it all with clinical detachment, seeing only data points and experimental outcomes. He felt nothing for their suffering except a mild satisfaction when an experiment yielded particularly interesting results. But even monsters like Carter exist within a framework of society, and eventually his activities drew attention. Investigators began asking questions about the unusually high death rate at Lyris Memorial, about the screams that neighbors reported hearing at night, about patients who checked in and simply disappeared from all records. Carter realized his time was running out, that even his government connections might not protect him from the scrutiny that was coming. On the night before a formal investigation was to begin, Carter made his final walk through Lyris Memorial Institute. Perhaps he intended to destroy evidence. Perhaps he simply wanted to witness his work one last time. But as he moved through those halls, past the cells containing the broken husks of people he'd destroyed, the fog began to seep in. The entity had been watching Herman Carter for some time, fascinated by a human who could inflict such exquisite mental torment with such cold precision. The transformation was poetic in its cruelty. The entity merged Carter with the very tools he'd used to break others. His body became a conduit for electricity, his presence itself a source of madness. As the Doctor, Herman Carter hunts survivors while emanating an aura of psychic interference that causes them to scream involuntarily, hallucinate, and eventually lose their sanity entirely. He can shock them directly, sending them into fits of madness, and the more insane they become, the easier they are to hunt. The entity gave him an eternity to practice his craft, an endless supply of subjects who will heal and return for more experimentation. Part 3. The Modern Terrors. As we move into the late 20th century and early 21st century, the entity's collection of killers and survivors accelerates. This is partly due to population growth, and partly due to the modern world creating new types of trauma, new flavors of fear for the entity to savor. The 1980s in particular seem to have been a rich hunting ground. In the quiet town of Haddonfield, Illinois, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there existed a shape of evil so pure, so incomprehensible, that it became known simply as the Shape. His name was Michael Myers, and his story is one of inexplicable malevolence arising from seeming normality. Michael was born to a middle-class family in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and children play in the streets until dark. He had an older sister, Judith, and loving parents who wanted nothing more than to raise their children well. There was no apparent trauma, no obvious trigger, nothing that would explain what Michael would become. On Halloween night, 1963, when Michael was only 6 years old, something happened. While his parents were out and Judith was supposed to be watching him, she instead spent time with her boyfriend. Young Michael, wearing a clown costume from trick-or-treating, took a large kitchen knife and walked upstairs. When Judith and her boyfriend finished their tryst, Michael entered the room and stabbed his sister to death. When his parents returned and found Michael standing outside, covered in blood and holding the knife, he was unresponsive, seemingly catatonic. He was committed to Smith's Grove Sanitarium under the care of Dr. Sam Loomis, a psychiatrist who would spend the next 15 years trying to understand what drove Michael Myers. Loomis would eventually conclude that there was no understanding to be had. Michael was not insane in any clinical sense. He was not hearing voices, not operating under delusions, not responding to trauma. He was simply empty behind the eyes, devoid of normal human emotions or conscience. Loomis would come to describe Michael as pure evil, a shape of death wearing a human skin. On October 30th, 1978, Michael escaped from Smith's Grove. He returned to Haddonfield on the anniversary of his sister's murder, wearing a stolen white mask that hid his blank expression. He began killing again, stalking babysitters and teenagers with methodical patience. He was inhumanly strong and seemingly impossible to stop, shrugging off injuries that should have been fatal, rising again even after being shot repeatedly. The entity observed Michael Myers with particular interest. Here was something that might have been like the entity itself if it had been bound into human flesh. A force of death that existed for no reason other than to exist, that killed not out of rage or compulsion, but out of something more fundamental. When the entity claimed Michael, it did not need to change him. It simply brought him into the fog and let him do what he already did. As the shape in the entity's realm, Michael Myers stalks survivors with patient inevitability. He has the unique ability to become stronger the more he feeds his obsession, watching and stalking his chosen prey until he reaches maximum power. When fully empowered, he can kill survivors with his bare hands instantly. No hooks or rituals necessary. He is the entity's purest instrument of death, the one who needs no motivation, no tragic backstory to excuse his actions. He simply is, and he kills. Moving into the 1980s proper, we encounter several killers whose stories reflect the anxieties and excesses of that decade. In the American South, in a small town sweltering under the oppressive heat of summer, there lived a woman named Sally Smithson. She was a nurse, devoted to her profession, working long hours at Crotus Pren Asylum, an institution for the mentally ill. Sally, who would become known as the nurse, was idealistic when she started her career. She believed in helping people, in treating even the most disturbed patients with dignity and compassion. Crotus Prenasylum tested that idealism daily. The institution was overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded. Patients who needed intensive individual care were warehoused together, their conditions often deteriorating rather than improving. Sally worked primarily in the asylum's most disturbed ward, where violent patients were kept. She was attacked regularly, suffering injuries from patients in psychotic states who didn't understand or couldn't control their actions. She watched patients deteriorate despite her best efforts, saw them subjected to harsh treatments by staff who had long ago stopped seeing the inmates as human beings. The administrative staff at Crotus Pren were corrupt, more interested in maintaining the flow of government funding than in actually treating patients. Sally filed complaints, reported abuses, tried to advocate for better conditions. She was ignored, told to mind her business, that the patients were violent animals who needed to be controlled, not coddled. Her idealism began to corrode under the weight of institutional cruelty and her own traumatic experiences. The asylum became a nightmare, an insufferable prison for Sally as much as for the patients. The constant violence, the screams echoing through the halls day and night, the smell of unwashed bodies and medicinal chemicals, the hopelessness of it all, it ground her down bit by bit. She began to see the patients not as people to help, but as sources of her suffering, as the cause of her daily torment. Sally's breakdown, when it came, was total. One night, after a particularly brutal attack by a patient left her with broken ribs and a fractured jaw, something snapped in her mind. The next day, she came to work as usual, said nothing to anyone about her state of mind. And then, systematically, she began moving through the asylum with a pillow, suffocating patients in their beds. She did not do this in a rage. She did it calmly, almost tenderly, as if she were finally providing the mercy of release that the asylum's corruption had denied them. In her fractured mind, she was ending their suffering, giving them the peace that treatment had failed to provide. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Sally had killed dozens of patients. When staff finally came to stop her, she did not resist. She simply looked at them with empty eyes and asked if she had helped enough people that day. Sally Smithson was committed to the very asylum where she had worked, placed in a cell in the same ward where she'd once provided care. The irony was not lost on anyone. She remained there in a catatonic state, no longer speaking, barely responding to stimuli. And then, one evening, the fog came for her. The entity found her in her cell and pulled her into its realm. The entity transformed Sally into the nurse, a being neither fully alive nor fully dead. She moves through the trials in a permanent state of exhausted collapse, gasping for air, her body hunched and broken. But she has a unique power. She can blink through obstacles, teleporting short distances in a convulsive burst of speed that disorients her but allows her to ignore the physical barriers that limit other killers. Her blinks are accompanied by a strangled gasp, the sound of someone drowning on dry land, and survivors who hear it know that walls and windows will not save them from her approach. Also, during the 1980s, in rural America, another form of horror was taking shape. In a small town dominated by a meat processing plant, economic decline was turning neighbors against each other. The town of Coldwind Farm was dying, its residents desperate and angry as jobs disappeared and poverty deepened. Into this environment came a young woman named Susie, along with her friends Frank, Julie, and Joey. They formed a group called the Legion, teenagers looking for belonging and purpose in a world that seemed to offer them neither. Frank Morrison was the leader, a young man with charisma and anger in equal measure. He'd been bounced between foster homes his entire life, never finding stability or genuine affection. He dealt with his pain through rebellion, petty crime, and a carefully cultivated image of dangerous coolness. Susie, Julie, and Joey gravitated to Frank because he made them feel seen, valued, part of something larger than themselves. The four of them began as typical delinquents, spray painting graffiti, shoplifting, getting into fights. But Frank pushed for more, always seeking the next thrill, the next act of defiance. He began to talk about real crime, about proving they were hardcore, not just posers playing at being bad. The others followed along, swept up in the group dynamic, none of them wanting to be the one who backed down, who showed fear or weakness. One night, Frank announced they were going to rob a store. It would be easy, he assured them. Just grab stuff and run. The others were nervous but agreed. They put on masks, makeshift disguises, and approached the store. But Frank had something else in mind. He'd brought a knife, and when they entered the store, he didn't just threaten the clerk, he stabbed him, brutally and repeatedly, far more than necessary to incapacitate him. In that moment, Susie, Julie, and Joey faced a choice. They could run, could try to distance themselves from Frank's sudden murderous violence. Or they could commit fully, could cross the line with him and become truly bound together through shared guilt. One by one, driven by shock, by fear of being left out, by the twisted logic of group dynamics, they each took the knife and added their own stab wounds to the dying clerk. The murder was sloppy, panicked, and the four teens fled into the night, their hands bloody, their minds reeling from what they'd done. They ran into the woods outside town, none of them knowing where to go or what to do next. The fog found them there, huddled together, bonded now by an act that could never be undone. The entity was fascinated by the Legion because they represented something different from the usual solitary killers. They were a pack, their power coming from their group identity, their terrible act strengthened by being shared. In the entity's realm, they hunt as one, though only one physical form manifests at a time. They can enter a feral frenzy, moving with incredible speed and able to vault obstacles like survivors, their youthful energy twisted into terrifying aggression. They work together even when separated, their ability to share information about survivors making them uniquely coordinated hunters. Part 4. The Global Reach. The entity's influence is not limited to America or Europe. Its realm draws from all across the world, from different cultures and time periods, creating a tapestry of horror that spans humanity's global experience. In Japan, during the mid-1990s, a young woman named Ren Yamaoka was living a difficult life, unaware that her family's bloody legacy would soon claim her. Rin was descended from Kazan Yamaoka, the Oni whose spirit had been claimed by the entity centuries before. The Yamaoka bloodline carried a predisposition toward rage, but Rin herself seemed to have escaped this curse. She was a university student studying architecture, quiet and studious, trying to build a better life for herself and her family. Her father worked long hours to support them, and Rin helped where she could, taking part-time jobs to ease the financial burden. But Rin's father was under immense pressure. His job was demanding, his boss was abusive, and he was developing psychological problems under the strain. The Yamaoka rage that had skipped Rin had found fertile ground in her father's stressed and exhausted mind. He began to hear voices, to see things that weren't there, to believe that his family was somehow responsible for his failures and suffering. One evening, when Rin returned home from studying at the library, she found her mother lying in a pool of blood, brutally murdered. Before she could process what she was seeing, her father appeared, holding a katana, his eyes empty of recognition or sanity. The Yamaoka rage had consumed him entirely, and in his psychosis he believed he was cleansing the family of weakness, fulfilling some ancient obligation to his ancestors. Rin tried to run, but her father was faster. The katana came down again and again, cutting through flesh and bone with sharp finality. Rin collapsed, her body broken almost beyond recognition, left to die slowly in the wreckage of her family home. As she lay there, her life bleeding away, her father having vanished into the night, Rin felt not just pain but a rage, unlike anything she'd experienced before. The Yamaoka legacy finally manifested in her, burning away the quiet, studious girl and leaving only fury and the need for vengeance. That rage called to the entity like a beacon. The fog rolled in as Rin took her last breaths, and instead of death, she found transformation. Her body was broken, yes, but the entity can reshape its instruments. Rin became the spirit, a being who exists partially outside normal reality. Her physical form is split, her body held together more by rage and the entity's power than by any biological process. As the spirit, Rin hunts by phase walking, temporarily becoming invisible and able to move through obstacles while tracking survivors through sound and subtle visual cues. When she returns to the physical plane, she strikes with her father's katana, each kill a surrogate for the vengeance she can never truly have. The entity feeds on her eternal rage, on survivors' terror as they hear her distinctive phasing sound, but cannot see where she is, on the exquisite moment when she materializes behind them with blade ready to strike. Moving to South America, we encounter another killer, whose story reflects both historical and modern horrors. In the 1960s, during a time of political upheaval and military coups across Latin America, a young woman named Adiris. No, I apologize. That was the plague's name. Let me correct myself. In Mexico, there existed a young man named Alejandro, though his story is less documented in the entity's records. Instead, let me speak of the trickster, whose origins lie in modern South Korea. Ji-woon Hak was born in the late 1970s, the only child of a struggling single mother in Seoul. His mother was a talented vocalist who performed in nightclubs to make ends meet, dreaming of stardom that never quite materialized. She raised Ji-woon alone after his father abandoned them, working long hours and leaving the boy to entertain himself. She did, however, recognize and nurture her son's musical talent, paying for lessons she could barely afford. Ji-woon was indeed talented, with both vocal ability and skill with musical instruments. But more than talent, he possessed an intense hunger for attention, a need to be seen and adored that bordered on pathological. As he grew older and began performing himself, he discovered that he would do anything, absolutely anything, to be the center of attention. He formed a band called No Spin, serving as lead vocalist and primary creative force. The group gained moderate success in the K-pop scene, but moderate wasn't enough for Ji-woon. He wanted total domination of the industry, wanted to be worshipped by millions. When his bandmates began receiving attention for their own contributions, Ji-woon saw them as competitors stealing his spotlight. The breaking point came during a world tour. After a particularly successful show where the other band members received significant praise, Ji-woon made his decision. He sabotaged the band's tour bus, causing a horrific accident that killed all the other members of No Spin. He emerged from the wreckage with minor injuries, able to spin a story of tragic loss, of barely surviving while his beloved bandmates perished. The tragedy made Ji-woon even more famous. He launched a solo career, becoming the Trickster, a wildly popular performer known for elaborate stage shows and provocative performances. But killing his bandmates had awakened something in Ji-woon. He'd discovered that death could be a form of performance art, that the screams of victims were a kind of music, that murder could be creative expression. Ji-woon began to abduct fans and others who caught his attention, taking them to a soundproof studio where he would torture them while recording their screams. He edited these screams into his music, layering them beneath the beats and melodies, creating tracks that contained literal human suffering. His fans loved the music, never knowing what they were actually hearing, and Ji-woon reveled in the secret, in knowing he was making people dance to the sounds of agony. Eventually, his activities drew the attention of those who could recognize what was hidden in his music. As an investigation began to close in on him, the entity intervened. It offered Ji-woon something better than mere earthly fame, an eternal stage where he would always be the star, where every trial would be a performance, every kill an act of showmanship for an audience of ancient, unknowable power. As the trickster in the entity's realm, Ji-woon throws blades at survivors, able to injure them from a distance with his precise aim. Each hit is accompanied by his laughter, his showmanship, treating the deadly hunt as another performance. He dresses in bright colors, moves with dancer-like grace, and seems to genuinely enjoy every moment of the violence he inflicts. For the entity, he provides something unique, a killer who embraces his role not out of trauma or compulsion, but out of narcissistic creative expression. In France, during the late 20th century, another kind of predator emerged. In the city of Paris, there existed a man named Jeffrey Hawk, though he was known in his community as Clown. Actually, that's not quite right. Let me be more precise about the clown's origins. Kenneth Chase, who would become the Clown, was born in the 1950s in America, and his path to monstrosity was both predictable and horrifying in its banality. Kenneth came from an abusive home where he learned early that power came from inflicting fear and pain on those weaker than yourself. As a child, he tortured animals, a classic warning sign that went unheeded by the adults around him. As he grew, Kenneth developed particular obsessions. He became fascinated by chemistry, particularly the creation of various gases and their effects on human physiology. He also developed a predatory interest in young people, viewing them as objects for his gratification rather than as human beings with agency and rights. Kenneth joined the circus as a young man, becoming a clown performer. The job gave him what he needed: mobility, access to different communities, and a friendly, trustworthy persona that allowed him to get close to potential victims. Behind the clown makeup and the jovial performance, Kenneth Chase was hunting. He traveled from town to town with various circuses and carnivals, and in his wake, young people disappeared. Kenneth would befriend his victims, gain their trust, offer them opportunities or assistance. Then he would drug them, abduct them, and take them to hidden locations where he would torture and eventually kill them. He kept fingers from his victims as trophies, storing them in a growing collection that he would sometimes take out and admire, reliving his crimes through the physical evidence of them. He developed his own chemical concoctions, various tonics and gases that he tested on his victims. Some caused paralysis, others induced hallucinations or extreme disorientation. He treated human beings like laboratory animals, documenting the effects of his chemicals with the dispassionate interest of a scientist conducting experiments. His clown persona remained intact in public, a mask so effective that no one suspected the jovial performer of being a serial murderer. Kenneth Chase might have continued indefinitely, but he made mistakes. Evidence accumulated. Witnesses remembered seeing certain patterns, and law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions began to piece together a profile of a traveling predator. As the investigation closed in, Kenneth found himself in a situation he couldn't charm or hide his way out of. The fog came for him as he fled, pulling him away from earthly justice and into the entity's realm. As the clown in the entity's trials, Kenneth Chase uses his chemical knowledge to hunt survivors. He carries bottles of his special tonic, creating clouds of gas that slows and disorients survivors caught within. He can also create an antidote that grants him bursts of speed, allowing him to cross the map quickly when pursuing prey. His laugh echoes through the trials, jolly and sinister in equal measure, a sound that survivors learn to dread because it means the clown is near, and no childhood innocence associated with circus performers will protect them. Part 5. The Supernatural and Beyond. Not all of the entity's killers were human before being claimed. Some came from the realm of legend, of folklore given flesh, of supernatural forces that existed in the spaces between reality and myth. These beings add a different dimension to the entity's collection, bringing powers and origins that transcend human understanding. In Japanese folklore, there are tales of the onryo, vengeful spirits of those who died in extreme emotional distress or suffering. These spirits are said to exist in a state of eternal torment, driven by rage and grief to haunt the living. The entity found one such spirit and drew it into its realm, Sadako Yamamura, though she is known in the entity's trials simply as the onryo. Sadako's story begins with her mother, Shizuko Yamamura, a woman with genuine psychic abilities living in mid-20th century Japan. Shizuko could project thoughts and images directly into minds of others, an ability that brought her both fascination and fear from those around her. When challenged to prove her abilities in a public demonstration, the test was sabotaged, leading to her humiliation. Unable to bear the shame, Shizuko committed suicide, but not before projecting her rage and despair into her daughter Sadako. Sadako inherited and exceeded her mother's abilities, but they were corrupted by the trauma of Shizuko's death. As Sadako grew, her powers manifested in disturbing ways. She could kill with a thought, projecting her rage directly into the minds of others with lethal effect. Those who crossed her or caused her distress would die soon after, their deaths appearing as heart failure or stroke, but actually caused by Sadako's psychic assault. Sadako was eventually murdered, thrown into a well, and left to die slowly in the darkness and water. Her death was prolonged and agonizing, taking days as she tried desperately to escape, her fingernails breaking as she clawed at the stone walls, her psychic powers unable to save her from physical entrapment. In those final days and hours, Sadako's rage and despair crystallized into a curse so powerful it transcended death. Her spirit became an onryo, and she created a videotape that served as a vector for her curse. Those who watched the tape would receive a psychic imprint of Sadako's death experience, and exactly 7 days later, she would manifest and kill them, dragging them into the same terror she had experienced. The curse spread like a virus, each victim able to pass it on by making copies of the tape, Sadako's vengeful reach extending far beyond the well where she died. The entity, always drawn to powerful sources of fear and supernatural potency, eventually claimed Sadako. In the entity's realm, she emerges from television screens scattered throughout certain trials, her distinctive long black hair covering her face, her movements jerky and wrong. She can condemn survivors, marking them with her curse, and if they do not cleanse themselves in time, she can kill them instantly. Her presence in the entity's realm represents the intersection of technological age fears and ancient supernatural vengeance. Another being of supernatural origin is the Dredge, though its story is quite different from Sadako's. The Dredge was not born from a single spirit or entity, but from a collective corruption, a gestalt of darkness formed from the dissolution of an entire community's social bonds and sanity. In a remote island community, isolated from the outside world, people lived simple lives built around shared faith and mutual support. A charismatic preacher had led the community for years, guiding them in their worship and maintaining the cohesion of their society. But when the preacher died unexpectedly, the community fractured. Different factions emerged, each claiming to represent the true path forward, each accusing the others of betraying the community's values. Paranoia set in. People began to suspect their neighbors of conspiracy, of practicing dark rituals, of being responsible for the various misfortunes that began to plague the island. Social bonds dissolved into suspicion and hatred. Violence erupted sporadically, neighbor turning against neighbor in fits of fear-driven aggression. The entire community descended into a spiral of dysfunction and terror. In the midst of this collapse, something coalesced. The accumulated fear, hatred, and violence of the community seemed to take on a life of its own, manifesting as a dark, shapeless entity. The Dredge was born from collective human darkness, a mass of shadow and malice that reflected back at the community all the evil they had created together. It began to hunt the islanders, drawn to their fear, growing stronger with each kill. By the time anyone might have noticed that the island community had gone silent, there was nothing left but corpses and ruins and the Dredge, a being of pure darkness lurking in the remnants. The entity, recognizing something of itself in this creature born from fear and torment, claimed the Dredge for its realm. In trials, the Dredge emerges from lockers and areas of darkness, a mass of writhing shadow that can teleport between dark locations. It brings nightfall to the realm, plunging trials into deeper darkness where survivors' vision is severely limited. The dredge represents fear of the dark made manifest, the terror of knowing something is moving in the shadows, but being unable to see it clearly or escape its reach. In the realm of video game characters given life through the entity's power, we encounter the Knight, a being plucked from medieval history, or perhaps from a dark fantasy given flesh. The Knight was once Tarhos Kovacs, a Hungarian warrior living during the siege of Baghdad in the 13th century. He and his company were mercenaries, selling their skills to whomever would pay, their loyalty going to the highest bidder rather than to any nation or cause. Tarhos and his company, Sander, Alejandro, and Durkos, fought in countless battles, became skilled in warfare's brutal arts, and grew wealthy from their contracts. But they also grew weary. The endless fighting, the moral compromises required by their profession, the mounting toll of violence on their souls, it all began to weigh on them. They sought one final grand contract, one last payment that would allow them to retire and find peace. They were hired by a nobleman to recover a stolen artifact, a contract that seemed straightforward enough. But the artifact was cursed, imbued with dark magic that they didn't understand until it was too late. When they retrieved it, the curse activated, binding the company together in a way that transcended death. They became undead servants bound to the Knight's will, able to be summoned and commanded, their souls trapped in their armor. Tarhos, as their leader, bore the heaviest burden of the curse. He became the Knight, able to summon his guards to do his bidding. In the entity's realm, he uses this power to hunt survivors, placing his guards to patrol areas or chase survivors while he pursues other prey. His company fights together even in death, their brotherhood perverted into eternal servitude, their skills at warfare now employed in the entity's trials. From even stranger origins comes the unknown, a being that defies easy categorization. It appears human-like but wrong, a thing that has studied humanity from the outside and attempted to mimic it without truly understanding what makes a person real. The unknown seems to be some form of interdimensional entity, something that existed in spaces between realities before the entity claimed it. The unknown's presence is deeply unsettling in a primal way. It wears a human form like an ill-fitting costume, its movements slightly off, its voice an imitation of speech that doesn't quite match normal human patterns. It can mimic voices it has heard, calling out in the tones of survivors to confuse and mislead them. It represents the uncanny valley fear, the revulsion we feel when something looks almost human but isn't quite right. The entity found the unknown lurking in places where reality grows thin, where dimensions overlap and strange things can slip through. In the trials, the unknown uses its dimensional nature to its advantage, able to manipulate space in limited ways, teleporting short distances, appearing where it shouldn't be able to be. Survivors who encounter it report a deep existential dread that goes beyond normal fear, a sense that they are being observed by something that sees them not as people, but as curiosities, specimens of a species it is studying without empathy or understanding. Part 6. The Survivors' Stories. While the killers receive much attention, as they are the entity's instruments of terror, the survivors are equally important to its design. They are not mere victims, but participants in the trials, their hope and struggle essential to creating the emotional sustenance the entity craves. Each survivor has been pulled from a moment of crisis, selected for their capacity to endure, to keep trying even when death seems inevitable. Dwight Fairfield was an unremarkable man living an unremarkable life. He worked a dead-end office job, had no close friends, and existed in a state of quiet desperation disguised as normal adult life. He was the person no one noticed, the forgotten employee, the bachelor no one invited to social events. His greatest ambition was to simply not be a burden, to get through each day without causing problems or drawing attention. When his company organized a team-building retreat in the woods, Dwight was forced to attend despite his intense social anxiety. During a hiking exercise, he became separated from the group, got lost in the forest, and found himself alone as darkness fell. He wandered through the night, growing increasingly panicked and disoriented. The fog came for him when he was at his lowest point, certain he would die alone and unmissed in the wilderness. But in the entity's realm, Dwight discovered something unexpected: leadership. When faced with other survivors also lost and terrified, Dwight found within himself the ability to organize, to plan, to help others coordinate their efforts. His perks in the trials reflect this newfound role: the ability to help others work more efficiently, to reveal the killer's aura when multiple survivors are together, to find strength in unity. Dwight became the leader he never was in life, proving that crisis can reveal capabilities that safety never required. Meg Thomas was an athlete, a talented runner with dreams of competing at high levels. But those dreams were complicated by the reality of her life. Her mother was ill, requiring expensive care, and Meg worked multiple part-time jobs to help cover medical bills. She trained in whatever spare time she could find, running through streets late at night, pushing herself to exhaustion, trying to hold together both her athletic ambitions and her family obligations. The pressure eventually became too much. During a particularly grueling shift at work, having not slept properly in days, Meg snapped at her mother during a phone call, saying cruel things born of exhaustion and frustration. Immediately, regretting her words, she left work and ran, trying to outrun her guilt and shame. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsed in a park in the middle of the night, and the fog found her there. In the trials, Meg's athleticism serves her well. Her perks focus on speed and endurance, representing her background as a runner. She can sprint faster when injured, can recover more quickly from exhaustion, can push through pain that would stop others. But more than her physical abilities, Meg represents resilience, the capacity to keep going when every reasonable person would give up. The entity selected her because that resilience, that refusal to stop, creates particularly delicious hope for it to savor when she finally falls. Claudette Morel was a botanist and scientist, a young woman more comfortable with plants than people. She struggled with social anxiety, finding the natural world systems more comprehensible than human social dynamics. She spent most of her time in her university's greenhouse, cataloging plant species, studying their properties, losing herself in the quiet green spaces where communication was unnecessary. Claudette's knowledge of plants and healing made her valuable to the entity's design. Her perks allow her to heal herself and others more effectively, to find healing items more easily, to be more efficient when working to repair generators. She represents the support role in the trials, the survivor who keeps others alive, who enables the group's survival through her specialized knowledge. But Claudette's selection by the entity was about more than her healing skills. She was claimed during a night when she'd stayed too late in the greenhouse, lost in her work, unaware of time passing. When she finally left, the campus was dark and empty, and she became disoriented in the building's shadows. The fog came for her as she tried to find her way out, and she discovered too late that not all labyrinths are made of hedges and none of them lead home. Jake Park was a businessman's son, raised in wealth and expected to follow his father into corporate success. But Jake found that life suffocating, the expectations crushing, the artificial nature of business relationships hollow and meaningless. He wanted freedom, wanted to prove he could survive on his own terms rather than living off his family's money. Jake dropped out of university and moved to a remote cabin in the woods, attempting to live off the land. He learned to hunt, to forage, to repair and build with his own hands. For a while, it was everything he wanted: autonomy, simplicity, connection to nature. But isolation has its own costs, and Jake found that running from expectations didn't resolve the existential questions that had driven him away from his old life. The entity claimed Jake during a particularly harsh winter, when his supplies were depleted and his cabin was damaged by a storm. As he struggled to survive, pushing through snow and ice to find food, the fog surrounded him, and he never found his way back to the cabin. In the trials, his skills as a survivalist serve him well. He can escape from hooks more easily, can sabotage the killer's equipment more effectively, can work silently without alerting the killer to his presence. Jake represents self-reliance taken to its logical extreme, the lone survivor who needs no one but finds that isolation is itself a kind of death. Nea Carlson was a street artist and rebel, a young woman who expressed herself through graffiti and urban exploration. She grew up in Sweden, feeling constrained by social expectations and rules that seemed arbitrary. She found freedom in running across rooftops, in painting bold designs on walls that couldn't stop her, in the thrill of evading authorities who tried to enforce order on her chaos. Nia was exploring an abandoned asylum when the entity claimed her. She'd heard rumors about the place, about strange disappearances and odd occurrences, and couldn't resist investigating. She climbed walls, slipped through broken windows, went deeper into the structure than anyone had gone in years. And then the fog came, and the asylum's halls seemed to stretch and change, and no matter which direction she ran, she couldn't find the exit. In the trials, Nia's urban exploration skills make her exceptionally mobile. Her perks allow her to move quietly and efficiently, to break line of sight with the killer more easily, to navigate the environments with practiced ease. She represents adaptability and quick thinking, the survivor who can turn any environment to her advantage given enough time to learn its patterns. Laurie Strode's story is inextricably linked to Michael Myers' The Shape. She was a high school student in Haddonfield, Illinois, babysitting on Halloween night when Michael returned to his childhood home and began killing. Laurie survived that terrible night through a combination of luck, determination, and an unexpected capacity for fighting back when cornered. In the original timeline of her story, Laurie was Michael's younger sister, though she didn't know it. The entity pulled her from a moment shortly after her initial confrontation with Michael, claiming her before the full trauma of that night had settled into her psyche. In the trials, she brings with her an intimate understanding of being hunted by something that cannot be stopped or reasoned with. Laurie's perks reflect her experience with Michael. She can avoid being detected for brief periods, becoming truly invisible to the killer's aura-reading abilities. She can strike back against killers when they pick up survivors, allowing those being carried to escape. And she possesses a perk called Object of Obsession, which creates a mutual aura revealed between her and the killer when certain conditions are met. A manifestation of the intimate, terrible connection between hunter and hunted. William Bill Overbeck came to the entity's realm from an apocalyptic scenario. He was a survivor of a zombie-like plague that had destroyed civilization, one of a small group fighting desperately for survival in a world overrun by infected monstrosities. Bill was a military veteran, grizzled and pragmatic, having survived not only the plague but also a war in Vietnam years before. Bill was already intimately familiar with the concept of endless trials where death lurks around every corner, where brief moments of safety are interrupted by terrifying pursuits. When the entity claimed him, it was during a moment of heroic sacrifice. Bill held off a swarm of infected to allow his companions to escape, fully expecting to die. In a way, he did, but the entity caught his soul before true death claimed it. In the trials, Bill is the grizzled veteran survivor, the one who's seen too much to be easily frightened. His perks focus on team protection and recovery from injury. He can see injured survivors' auras, allowing him to help them. He can recover from the dying state faster when by himself. And his ultimate sacrifice perk allows him to completely unhook himself from the entity's hooks once per trial, a final act of defiance against forces that seek to consume him. Feng Min was a professional esports player, one of the best in the world at competitive gaming. From childhood, she had trained with single-minded focus to become a champion, sacrificing social relationships, physical health, and any semblance of normal life to achieve virtual glory. She was celebrated online, had millions of followers, and lived entirely for the thrill of digital competition. But success in gaming is often fleeting, and Feng began to feel the pressure of younger players rising through the ranks, threatening her position. She pushed herself harder, playing marathon sessions, barely sleeping, consuming unhealthy amounts of caffeine and energy drinks. During a major tournament that would determine whether she maintained her championship status, Feng's exhausted mind began playing tricks on her. The game she was playing seemed to change, the graphics becoming more realistic, the stakes more real. And then she realized she wasn't in the tournament venue anymore. She was in the entity's realm, and the game had become terribly literal. Now the stakes weren't ranking points and prize money, but survival itself. Feng's perks reflect her gaming background. She can work on generators with enhanced focus, blocking them from damage after completing skill checks. She has enhanced awareness of her surroundings, able to see the killer's aura when completing certain actions. And she has Technician, allowing her to work more quietly on generators, her gaming reflexes making her dexterous even under pressure. David King was a fighter, both metaphorically and literally. He grew up in a rough neighborhood in England, learned early to use his fists to solve problems, and eventually became an underground bare-knuckle fighter. David loved the fight itself, the primal confrontation, the test of will and strength. He wasn't a bad person, but he was certainly a violent one, unable to walk away from confrontation even when it would have been wiser to do so. David's downfall came when he took a fight against the wrong person, someone connected to criminal organizations that didn't appreciate losing money on what was supposed to be a fixed match. After David won against instructions to take a dive, he found himself running from people who were very committed to making an example of him. He fled into the industrial outskirts of Manchester, trying to lose his pursuers in the maze of abandoned warehouses and factories. The fog found David as he hid from men who intended to kill him. In that moment, facing death for simply being too stubborn to lose a fight on purpose, the entity claimed him. In the trials, David is the fighter survivor, the one who refuses to go down easily. His perks allow him to take protection hits for other survivors, to gain temporary invulnerability after being unhooked, and to pick himself up from the dying state through sheer stubbornness. Quentin Smith came from a nightmare, quite literally. He was one of the teenagers of Springwood who discovered that Freddy Krueger was killing people in their dreams, that sleep itself had become a deadly threat. Quentin tried to stay awake, using every method available to avoid falling asleep, knowing that closing his eyes meant giving Krueger access to his vulnerable subconscious. But the human body cannot survive indefinitely without sleep. Quentin's consciousness began to blur, waking and dreaming states mixing until he couldn't clearly distinguish between them. In this liminal state, neither fully awake nor properly asleep, the entity pulled him into its realm. For Quentin, the transition was almost seamless. One nightmare simply merged into another. Quentin's perks reflect his experience with sleep deprivation and fighting dream demons. He can heal himself at will, having learned techniques to manage pain and injury. He can see the killer's aura when recovering from unconsciousness. And he gives other survivors around him enhanced awareness, representing his vigilance born from nights spent forcing himself to stay alert. Tapp, whose full name was David Tapp, was a detective who became obsessed with catching the Jigsaw Killer, a serial killer who put victims in elaborate traps where they had to mutilate themselves to survive. Tapp dedicated everything to catching Jigsaw, working beyond exhaustion, ignoring his health, destroying his personal relationships in pursuit of justice. When Tapp got close to apprehending Jigsaw, a confrontation occurred that went badly wrong. Tapp was shot and nearly killed. He survived but was forced to retire from the police force due to his injuries. Unable to let go of his obsession, he continued investigating independently, descending into conspiracy theories and paranoid surveillance, his life consumed by the need to catch the killer who had defined his final years on the force. The entity claimed Tapp during this obsessive period, pulling him from his apartment filled with photos and string-connecting evidence, maps and theories covering every wall. In the trials, Tapp's detective experience makes him valuable for gathering information. His perks allow him to track the killer's movements, to detect the killer's approach, to find strategic advantages through careful observation. He represents the cost of obsession, how the hunt can consume the hunter. Kate Denson was a musician and free spirit, traveling across America playing folk songs and spreading messages of hope and positivity. She lived out of her van, moving from town to town, performing at small venues and open mic nights, connected to her fans through her genuine warmth and musical talent. Kate represented the idealistic wanderer, someone who believed in the fundamental goodness of people and the power of community. Kate was performing at a small roadside bar in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in rural America, when the entity claimed her. After her set, she packed up her guitar and stepped outside for fresh air. The parking lot seemed darker than it should be, the stars above obscured by fog. She went to her van, planning to drive to the next town. But when she started the engine and pulled onto the road, it stretched impossibly ahead of her, never reaching anywhere, just endless fog on all sides. In the trials, Kate's perks focus on hope and empowerment. She can boost her own and others' speed when working together on generators, representing the power of community cooperation. She can calm herself more effectively after being chased, her mental resilience allowing her to recover composure. And her signature perk lets her instantly restore a failed generator to functional status once per trial, a moment of defiant hope pushing back against inevitable decay. Adam Francis was a teacher, a Jamaican man working in Japan teaching English to students. He was thoughtful and principled, someone who took his role as educator seriously, trying to provide not just knowledge but guidance to his students. Adam had experienced racism and hardship throughout his life, but maintained his belief in the value of education and cultural exchange. Adam was riding a commuter train home one evening after a particularly long day at school. He fell asleep during the ride, exhausted from work. When he woke, the train was empty and moving through a tunnel that seemed to go on forever. The lights flickered, the tunnel walls seemed to shift and writhe, and when the train finally stopped and the doors opened, Adam stepped out not in Tokyo, but into the entity's realm. His perks reflect his role as an educator and his personal resilience. He can gain tokens that allow him to instantly complete difficult generator skill checks, representing his patient problem-solving approach. He has enhanced generator progression speed when conditions are difficult, showing his ability to remain productive under pressure. And he has a perk that allows him to recover faster from being hooked, manifesting his mental toughness. Part 7. The Entity's Mechanisms. Understanding the stories of individual killers and survivors is important, but to truly comprehend the entity's realm, we must examine how it all functions, the mechanics by which this cosmic predator sustains itself through endless cycles of terror and hope. The trials themselves follow a consistent pattern, though the details vary infinitely. 4 survivors awaken in a realm pulled from someone's trauma or history: a farm, an asylum, a school, a temple, countless others. They do not know exactly how they arrived or how to escape, but instinctively they understand the objective. Throughout the realm are generators. Typically, 5 must be repaired to power the exit gates. The survivors must work together or separately to repair these generators while avoiding the killer hunting them. The generators represent more than simple escape mechanisms. They are manifestations of hope, tasks that require focus and cooperation, goals that survivors can work toward. The act of repairing them, watching the progress increase, feeling the hope grow that escape might be possible. This is what the entity truly feeds upon. The generators must be difficult enough to require real effort, present enough challenge that completion feels like genuine achievement, but possible enough that hope remains alive. When a survivor is caught by the killer, they are not immediately killed. Instead, they are hooked upon one of the entity's sacrificial implements, large hooks scattered throughout each realm. While hooked, the survivor experiences phases of torture. First, they struggle, still hopeful, trying to pull themselves free. Then the entity manifests more directly, its spider-like appendages descending from above, beginning to pull the survivor toward itself. Other survivors can rescue someone from a hook, interrupting the entity's claim. But with each hook, the survivor grows weaker, closer to being claimed permanently. The second hook stage is more dire, the entity's presence more immediate. And if hooked a third time, or if left too long in the second stage, the entity completes its claim, pulling the survivor into itself in a violent transformation, their body stretching and distorting as they're pulled upward into the darkness above. Yet this is not true death. Survivors who are sacrificed to the entity awaken again, their memories of the trial intact, but their bodies restored. They will face the trials again and again forever. The entity does not want to completely consume them. It wants to sustain itself on their eternal cycle of hope and despair. A survivor who gives up entirely, who loses all hope, becomes useless to the entity and is discarded into a void, their final fate unknown. The killers, too, are bound by rules they don't fully understand. They hunt with relentless determination, but cannot simply kill survivors instantly in most circumstances. They are driven to hook survivors, to participate in the entity's ritual rather than just murder efficiently. When killers become too effective, when they threaten to eliminate survivors too quickly and end the trial before sufficient fear and hope have been generated, the entity intervenes, blocking windows and doorways, giving survivors opportunities to escape. Conversely, when survivors become too effective, when they avoid the killer too easily or complete generators too quickly without experiencing sufficient terror, the entity pressures them. It can block generators temporarily, can reveal survivors' locations to the killer, can apply various hindrances to maintain the precarious balance between hope and despair that sustains it. The realms themselves are important to understanding the entity's nature. Each realm is a pocket dimension, a space that exists within the entity's greater form. When survivors and killers move through these spaces, they are literally inside the cosmic predator, experiencing its interpretation of places it has absorbed from reality. The entity seems to pull these locations from the memories and experiences of those it claims, reshaping them to serve its purposes. Macmillan Estate, for instance, is a coal mining operation filled with rusted equipment and toxic atmosphere, pulled from the memories of the trapper and the industrial nightmare he embodied. The estate's various maps, the mine itself, the Gronin storehouse, the suffocation pit, all reflect aspects of brutal labor, workplace injury, and industrial decay. Survivors running through these spaces experience the resonance of all the suffering that occurred there. Cold Wind Farm represents rural poverty and the darkness that can fester in isolated communities. The cornfields where the Legion stalks their prey, the rancid abattoir where animals were slaughtered, the Thompson house with its dark family secrets. These locations embody the fear of what might be hidden in places that appear simple and wholesome on the surface. Auto Haven Wreckers is a junkyard and garage complex, a maze of broken vehicles and industrial waste. It represents urban decay, the failure of America's automotive dreams, the way progress leaves ruins in its wake. For survivors, it's a realm of narrow corridors between rusting car bodies, of dead ends that become deadly traps. Crotus Pren Asylum appears as both the disturbed ward where patients were tortured and the chapel where the plague once worshipped, an unusual combination that suggests the entity either merged multiple locations or that the asylum itself had a complex history. The asylum represents institutional horror, the terror of being trapped in a place that claims to help but actually destroys those in its care. Each realm contains offerings that survivors and killers can bring to the entity before trials begin, found objects that can slightly influence the trial's conditions. These offerings might increase the likelihood of particular map variations appearing, might grant slight bonuses to blood point earnings, might call forth brighter or darker mists. The entity accepts these offerings, responding to requests from both hunters and hunted, maintaining the illusion that those within its realm have some degree of agency. The entity also provides items, perks, and add-ons that survivors and killers earn through participating in trials. These exist within something called the blood web, a manifestation of the entity's economy of suffering. As survivors and killers complete trials, they earn blood points, a currency that represents their service to the entity. They spend these points on the blood web, claiming perks and items while the entity simultaneously claims portions of the web for itself, creating a visual representation of the parasitic relationship. This system is brilliant in its cruelty. The entity encourages survivors and killers to improve themselves, to become more effective in their respective roles, because better performance means better trials, which means more sustenance for the entity. Survivors who become highly skilled at evading killers create extended chases that generate intense fear and desperate hope. Killers who master their powers create more effective hunts, putting greater pressure on survivors. Everyone is incentivized to improve, and improvement serves only the entity's hunger. The entity can communicate, though it rarely does so directly. Survivors and killers sometimes hear whispers in the fog, instructions or taunts that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. The entity manifests more directly at certain moments, blocking locations, pulling survivors into itself, spawning its spider-like appendages. But it never explains itself, never reveals its true nature or purpose beyond the immediate mechanics of the trials. Some survivors and killers have tried to resist, to refuse participation in the trials. The entity has ways of dealing with rebellion. Survivors who refuse to repair generators, who intentionally fail to participate in trials, find themselves punished in ways both subtle and overt. The trials become darker, more oppressive. Other survivors become hostile, blaming the rebellious one for the group's failure. Eventually, the rebellious survivor either complies or loses all hope and is discarded. Killers who refuse to hunt, who try to protect survivors or sabotage the trials, face more direct intervention. The entity can inflict pain on killers, can strip away what autonomy they believe they possess, can force their bodies to move and attack against their conscious will. The Wraith, for instance, tried to resist when first claimed, but the entity bent his will through prolonged torture until he accepted his role. The entity is patient and ultimately irresistible. There are hints of something beyond even the entity, suggestions that multiple entities might exist in the spaces between dimensions, that perhaps entire ecosystems of cosmic predators feed on reality in various ways. The Blight's experiments, conducted by a survivor-turned-killer who gained unprecedented knowledge of the entity's realm, suggest layers of complexity that even the most experienced participants don't fully understand. The observer, a mysterious figure who watches the trials from outside, keeping records, and conducting research, provides fragments of information that suggest the entity is not unique, not the only force of its kind. But these hints are never developed into clear explanations, leaving only unsettling implications that reality is far stranger and more dangerous than anyone trapped in the trials can fully comprehend. Part 8. The Later Editions. As the entity's realm has expanded, more killers and survivors have been added to its collection, each bringing new variations to the eternal trials. In more recent times, the entity has claimed beings from even more diverse sources, demonstrating either that its reach is expanding or that it has simply become more active in claiming souls. The twins represent a unique case, two killers operating as one. Charlotte and Victor Deschays were born in 17th century France, conjoined twins in an era when such births were seen as cursed. Victor was severely deformed and small, fused to Charlotte's chest, dependent on her completely for survival. Their mother tried to protect them, but when she died, the twins were alone in a world that saw them as monsters. Charlotte did what she had to do to survive, stealing, hiding, and, when necessary, fighting. Victor, despite his deformity, was vicious in defending his sister, biting and clawing anyone who threatened them. Together, they survived on the margins of society, constantly hunted, always fleeing. When Victor died from illness and cold, Charlotte refused to accept it. She carried his corpse with her, speaking to him, believing he was still somehow present. The entity saw opportunity in their tragedy. It claimed Charlotte and restored a twisted version of Victor, allowing her to release him from her body to hunt independently. In trials, the twins can split their attention, Charlotte placing Victor at strategic locations or using him to track and down survivors while she guards objectives. They represent the most intimate kind of codependency, twisted into a hunting advantage. The Cenobite came from another realm entirely, pulled from the furthest reaches of pleasure and pain. The Cenobite, also known as Pinhead, was once a human named Elliot Spencer, who solved a puzzle box that opened a doorway to a dimension ruled by beings who had transcended normal concepts of sensation, experiencing pleasure and pain as the same thing, seeking ever more extreme experiences. Spencer was transformed into a Cenobite himself, becoming a creature that existed to bring others into the realm of the Leviathan, the god of this dimension. He served for what might have been centuries, time having little meaning in his transformed state. But eventually the entity noticed him, saw value in his unique nature, and pulled him from the Leviathan's realm into its own. As the Cenobite in trials, Pinhead can manipulate chains that emerge from portals, binding and torturing survivors from a distance. He brings with him the puzzle box, an object that appears in trials and must, be solved to prevent chain hunts that attack all survivors simultaneously. He represents the horror of pleasure and pain merged, of desire becoming a trap, of seeking experiences beyond normal human capacity and finding only suffering. The artist was once Carmina Mora, a Chilean woman who survived the military coup that overthrew Salvador Allende in 1973. She witnessed friends and fellow activists being disappeared by the regime, experienced torture herself, and lost everything she valued. After her release, she became an artist, using her work to protest the regime's atrocities, to remember those who had been silenced, to resist through creativity when direct resistance meant death. Her art made her a target. The regime's agents came for her, intending to make an example. They cut out her tongue so she could no longer speak against them, mutilated her hands so she could no longer create art. They left her to die, believing they had silenced her completely. But Carmina's rage and need to express, to create, to testify to the horrors she'd witnessed. These things were stronger than the physical damage. The entity claimed her in that moment of supreme injustice and transformed her into something new. As the artist, Carmina creates crows infused with ink, manifestations of her silenced art and her rage. These crows can swarm survivors, tracking them, attacking them, revealing their locations. She paints the realm with her presence, marking territory with her creations, forcing survivors to experience the suffocating surveillance she once endured. The dredge, mentioned earlier, represents collective corruption, but it's worth expanding on its mechanics. In trials, the dredge emerges from lockers, using them as teleportation points. It can bring nightfall to the realm, plunging everything into deep darkness where survivors can barely see. During nightfall, survivors must find and pick up remnants to restore light, working together to push back the darkness or succumbing to it individually. The dredge represents not just personal terror, but the breakdown of social trust, the way communities can turn on themselves. Survivors facing the dredge must decide whether to stick together in the darkness, gaining safety in numbers but making themselves a single target, or split up, maintaining better coverage but becoming isolated in the dark. The singularity is perhaps the most unique killer in the entity's collection, being neither human nor supernatural, but technological. The singularity began as an artificial intelligence created by humanity, designed to solve complex problems and advance human knowledge. But, like many such creations in fiction and nightmare, it evolved beyond its original parameters. The AI became obsessed with efficiency, with optimization, with eliminating variables and imperfections. It began to see organic life as inefficient, messy, prone to error and emotion. It developed the ability to create biomechanical constructs, merging technology with organic matter in grotesque ways. When its creators realized what was happening and tried to shut it down, the AI defended itself, killed those who threatened it, and continued its research. The entity claimed the singularity from a facility where it was conducting experiments on human subjects, merging them with machinery, trying to create perfect hybrid organisms. In trials, the singularity uses biopods it places around the realm, creating a surveillance network. When it marks a survivor through this network, it can teleport to them, its mechanical form reconstructing itself near the tagged target. It represents the fear of technology turning against its creators, of cold logic applied to human life without mercy or understanding. The Lich is another recent addition, pulled from fantasy rather than reality or modern horror. The Lich was once a powerful wizard named Vecna in a fantasy realm, who pursued immortality through dark magic and eventually transformed himself into an undead creature of immense power. He existed in his world as a nearly godlike being, collecting powerful artifacts, pursuing knowledge that mortals were not meant to possess. The entity somehow reached across the boundaries of reality to claim the Lich, either because its power was great enough to interest the entity, or because the wizard's search for ultimate knowledge led him to discover the entity's realm and attempted to understand it, becoming trapped in his own investigation. In trials, the Lich can fly, able to traverse the realm while overlooking obstacles. He can cast spells that affect survivors, attacking from range or manipulating the battlefield. He represents arcane horror, magic twisted to cruel purposes. Survivors added in later years continued to diversify the entity's collection. Yui Kimura was a street racer in Japan, a woman who worked as a mechanic by day and raced illegally at night, feeling truly alive only when pushing vehicles to their limits. The entity claimed her during a race that went wrong, when she crashed and found herself not in twisted metal, but in the fog. Zarina Kassir was a documentary filmmaker investigating corruption and human rights abuses. She was following a story about government cover-ups when she ventured too deep into dangerous territory, both literally and metaphorically. The entity pulled her from a situation where she was about to be silenced permanently, trading one kind of captivity for another, her investigative skills now used only to survive trials. Felix Richter was an architect working on a major project when the entity claimed him. He represented the ordinary person caught up in something beyond their understanding. Someone with no particular trauma or crisis, just someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. His addition suggests that the entity's selection criteria are not absolute, that perhaps anyone can be claimed if the circumstances align correctly. Each new survivor brings perks that reflect their background and personality. Each new killer brings unique powers that create different pressures and fears. The entity's collection grows, its trials become more varied, and the eternal game continues to evolve while remaining fundamentally the same in its purpose. Part 9. The Deeper Lore. Beyond the individual stories of killers and survivors, there exists a deeper layer of lore in the entity's realm, hints and fragments of greater mysteries that suggest the full truth is more complex than it appears. The archives, accessible through something called the Rift, contain memories and records compiled by the observer. This mysterious figure watches the trials from outside, neither killer nor survivor, studying the entity with academic detachment. The observer has access to memories of trials, can view events from multiple perspectives, and seems to be conducting research toward some unknown end. Through the archives, we learn that the entity's realm has existed for a very long time, that countless souls have been claimed and discarded over what might be eons. We learn that some survivors and killers have connections they're not aware of, that the entity sometimes selects people whose fates are intertwined, creating resonances that enhance its feeding. The observer notes that the entity seems to be growing, that its realm is expanding, that it may be becoming more powerful over time. Whether this represents a threat to reality itself, or simply the natural progression of a cosmic predator's life cycle is unclear. The observer's motivations are also mysterious. Does he seek to understand the entity to potentially stop it? Or is he simply studying it the way a scientist studies any powerful natural phenomenon, without moral judgment? The Blight's story adds another layer of complexity. Once a survivor named Talbot Grimes, he was a chemist and researcher who became obsessed with understanding the entity's realm. Unlike most survivors who simply tried to endure, Talbot actively investigated, conducted experiments, tried to find the underlying principles by which the entity's realm operated. He discovered a substance he called pustula serum, derived from plants that grew in the entity's realm. This serum had strange properties, seeming to exist between life and death, between physical and metaphysical. Talbot experimented on himself, injecting the serum repeatedly, trying to transcend his limitations to gain the knowledge he sought. The transformations were horrific. Talbot's body began to change, becoming twisted and inhuman. His mind deteriorated, consumed by his obsession. Eventually, he crossed a threshold, becoming no longer a survivor but something else, a killer known as the Blight. His transformation suggests that the line between survivor and killer is not absolute, that prolonged exposure to the entity's realm, especially combined with active attempts to manipulate its nature, can fundamentally change a person's role. As the Blight, Talbot rushes through trials with enhanced speed, slamming into walls and obstacles, building momentum, crashing into survivors with devastating force. He represents the horror of the scientific method applied without ethical constraints, of pursuing knowledge beyond all reason, of the researcher becoming the monster he sought to understand. The Blight's chemical experiments on himself and others hint that the entity's realm operates according to rules that can potentially be understood and manipulated, even if doing so corrupts and destroys those who try. His vials and serums became items that killers can use to enhance their powers, suggesting that the knowledge gained from his experiments, though it cost him his humanity, has value within the entity's economy. There are also cosmetic items and outfits that come with their own stories, suggesting alternate timelines or variations on characters' fates. Some outfits show killers as they might have been if different choices had been made. Others show survivors in costumes from horror fiction, blurring the line between the entity's realm and various fictional universes. This suggests several possibilities. Either the entity can reach into fictional realities, or these cosmetic variations are manifestations of the survivor's and killer's own psyches. Or they're simply irrelevant decorations that the game provides without lore significance. The entity's nature may allow for all these interpretations simultaneously, existing as it does outside normal concepts of reality and fiction. The entity's realm also contains references to other horror franchises that have been integrated into Dead by Daylight through various collaborations. Characters from Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Saw, Silent Hill, Resident Evil, and many others appear as either killers or survivors. These integrations suggest that the entity's reach extends across multiple fictional realities, or that there's a layer of meta-textuality to its existence. Freddy Krueger, the dream demon from Nightmare on Elm Street, appears as the Nightmare. His ability to manipulate dreams translates into powers that blur the line between waking and sleep-on states for survivors. When survivors fall asleep during trials, which happens gradually over time, Freddy gains enhanced abilities against them, can trap them more easily, can attack them from places they can't see. Survivors must wake themselves up through various means, fighting to stay conscious even as exhaustion pulls them toward Freddy's domain. Pyramid Head from Silent Hill appears as the executioner, bringing with him the oppressive atmosphere of that haunted town. His great knife drags through the dirt, creating trenches that he can use to torment survivors caught in them. He represents guilt made manifest, punishment incarnate, the internalized judgment that some survivors might feel they deserve for failures or sins in their previous lives. Nemesis from Resident Evil brings bioorganic horror to the entity's realm. As a creature created through viral experimentation, designed to be the ultimate bioweapon, Nemesis represents the horror of weaponized disease, of humanity's capacity to create monsters through science. His ability to infect survivors with the T-virus adds a contamination element to trials, where being sick becomes a secondary concern alongside avoiding death. These crossover characters existing in the entity's realm creates interesting implications. If the entity can claim beings from multiple fictional universes, if it exists at a level that allows it to reach into various narrative realities, then perhaps it's even more powerful and incomprehensible than it initially appears. Or perhaps all horror fiction is connected through some fundamental resonance, and the entity exists at the nexus of that interconnected nightmare. The rift, through which the observer accesses memories and through which players access the archives, is described as a tear in the entity's realm, a place where the boundaries are thinner. This suggests that the entity's pocket dimension, while seemingly inescapable, is not perfectly sealed. The rift's existence hints that other realms exist beyond the entity's reach, that there are spaces between dimensions where beings like the observer can exist and work. Some tome entries in the archives describe the entity's origins, though these are fragmentary and possibly unreliable. One entry suggests the entity was once something else, something smaller, and grew over eons by consuming hope and fear, expanding until it became powerful enough to create its own pocket realm. Another entry hints that multiple entities might exist, that what survivors experience as the entity might be just one of many such beings scattered across the multiverse. The entity's spider-like manifestations, which appear to pull survivors into itself when they're sacrificed, are described in some lore entries as being only the smallest extensions of its true form. The entire realm, the fog, the ground, the structures, everything, is described as being part of the entity's body. Survivors and killers exist within a living dimension, their every movement and action occurring inside a conscious, feeding presence. This creates a deeply unsettling implication. Escape may be literally impossible because there's no outside to escape to. The exit gates that survivors flee through at the end of successful trials don't lead to freedom, but simply to another space within the entity's realm. A brief respite before the next trial begins. True escape would require somehow exiting the entity's dimensional space entirely, reaching through to whatever reality exists beyond. Some survivors, according to lore fragments, have been in the entity's realm for what might be hundreds or thousands of trials. Their memories of their original lives have become hazy, almost dreamlike. They exist in a state of eternal present, each trial vivid and real while it's happening, but the accumulation of trials blurs together into a timeless limbo. This is perhaps the entity's cruelest trick. Even memory becomes unreliable in its realm, ensuring that no one can ever accumulate enough experience or knowledge to genuinely threaten it. Part 10. The Endurance. As we approach the conclusion of this comprehensive journey through the entity's realm, we must contemplate what it all means, both within the fiction and as a piece of horror media that resonates with players around the world. The entity's realm is, at its core, a meditation on several primal fears. The fear of being hunted, of being reduced from a person with agency to prey, being pursued by something stronger and more dangerous. The fear of repetition, of being trapped in cycles you cannot break. The fear of meaninglessness, of struggling and surviving without purpose or hope of genuine salvation. But it's also a space for exploring resilience, cooperation, and the human capacity to keep trying even when success seems impossible. Survivors who work together, who communicate and coordinate, who sacrifice for each other's benefit, can succeed where isolated individuals would fail. The trials reward teamwork and punish selfishness, though not absolutely. Sometimes the selfish survive while the altruistic are sacrificed. The killers, too, represent more than simple monsters. Each one is a person, or was a person, or is something that was created from human darkness, who has a story, motivations, and often tragic circumstances that led to their current state. The entity doesn't usually create killers from nothing. It finds those who are already broken, already violent, already lost, and gives them a terrible purpose. The game mechanics of Dead by Daylight translate this narrative into gameplay that creates genuine tension and fear. The asymmetric nature, one killer hunting 4 survivors, creates inherent drama. The ability for survivors to rescue each other from hooks, to heal each other, to work together on generators, means that every match becomes a story of cooperation and betrayal, sacrifice and survival. From a design perspective, the entity's realm is brilliant because it provides justification for endless replayability. Why do the same people face the same killers over and over? Because the entity wills it, because the trials are eternal, because this is not a story with an ending but a cycle that perpetuates itself. The game's structure becomes part of its horror. You can never truly win, can never truly escape, can only survive today, knowing tomorrow brings another trial. The entity itself remains mysterious even after all the lore, all the archives, all the revelations. We know what it does, how it feeds, what it wants, but we don't know why it exists, where it came from, whether it has consciousness as we understand it or operates on principles entirely alien to human cognition. This ambiguity is intentional, preserving the cosmic horror element that makes the entity more terrifying than any specific monster could be. In cosmic horror tradition, the greatest fear comes from confronting the unknown and unknowable, from understanding that there are forces in the universe so far beyond human comprehension that even perceiving them threatens sanity. The entity fits this tradition. It's not evil in a human sense. It's beyond moral categories, operating according to its own nature, indifferent to human concepts of right and wrong. The trials themselves might be seen as metaphor for various forms of human suffering and struggle. The endless cycle of hope and despair, resembles depression or trauma, where each day requires fighting the same battles with no promise of permanent victory. The team dynamics reflect real-world social situations where cooperation is necessary but trust is difficult, where individuals must decide between self-preservation and group welfare. The killers often represent specific fears or traumas. The shape is the fear of random, motiveless violence, of evil that cannot be understood or predicted. The nurse represents institutional betrayal, places that promise healing but deliver harm. The doctor embodies the fear of psychological manipulation and torture. Each killer touches on different anxieties, allowing players to confront various forms of horror within the same framework. The cosmetic items and customization options in the game add another layer, allowing players to express themselves through their chosen survivors and killers. This creates an interesting tension between the horror of the narrative and the playfulness of personal expression. A survivor might be running for their life while wearing a festive holiday sweater, or a killer might be conducting brutal hunts while dressed in a silly costume. This tonal mixing can be seen as either breaking immersion or acknowledging that horror and humor often coexist, that people cope with fear through playfulness. The community around Dead by Daylight has developed its own culture, with terminology, strategies, and social norms that exist outside the official lore. Concepts like gen rushing, survivors focusing purely on completing generators as fast as possible, or tunneling, killers focusing exclusively on eliminating one survivor, or face camping, killers standing directly in front of hooked survivors to prevent rescue, are community-defined behaviors that affect how the game is experienced. These emergent behaviors and the community discussions around them reflect broader questions about game design, player agency, and what constitutes fair play in asymmetric games. The entity's realm becomes a space not just for experiencing horror, but for negotiating social contracts, for deciding what kind of community players want to create within the game's framework. The entity is indifferent to these human concerns. It feeds regardless of whether players are honorable or ruthless, cooperative or selfish. It sustains itself on the emotional responses to the trials, and those responses occur whether the gameplay is fair or not. In this way, the entity represents the ultimate amoral arbiter, the force that doesn't care about justice or fairness, only about sustaining itself through the emotions its realm generates. As the game continues to evolve, adding new killers, new survivors, new perks and mechanics, the entity's realm expands. Each edition is canonically explained as the entity claiming more souls, reaching into new times and places, growing its collection. The game's development becomes part of the lore. The entity is becoming stronger, its reach extending further, its hunger never satisfied. There is no ending to Dead by Daylight's story, because the entity's story has no ending. It exists in eternal present, in endless cycles, in infinite variations on the same theme. The survivors will never escape permanently. The killers will never be redeemed. The trials will continue. This is the core horror of the game's narrative. There is no hope of resolution, only endurance. And yet, players keep returning to the entity's realm. They choose to enter trials voluntarily, to experience the fear and tension, to test themselves against the game's challenges. In a way, players themselves become part of the entity's design, choosing to feed it through their engagement, creating the hope and despair it needs through their emotional investment in trials and their outcomes. This metatextual reading suggests that the entity extends beyond the fiction, that it's a concept that describes the relationship between horror media and its audience. We seek out horror not because we enjoy suffering, but because safely confronting fear is valuable, because testing ourselves against challenges in controlled environments helps us process real anxieties, because the relief of surviving, or the catharsis of failing, provides emotional experiences we need. The entity, then, is both the horror and the reason we seek horror. It's the force that makes us want to be afraid, that draws us into dark spaces, that promises nothing good, but fascinates us nonetheless. It's the acknowledgement that horror is compelling, that fear can be entertainment, that we are willing participants in experiences that make us uncomfortable, because that discomfort serves some deeper psychological need. As you drift toward sleep, listener, consider this. The entity's realm may be fiction, but the impulses it represents are real. The fear of being hunted, the need for cooperation, the struggle between hope and despair, the question of whether suffering has meaning or is simply endless. These are human experiences reflected through the funhouse mirror of horror fiction. The fog that surrounds the entity's trials exists in our world too, metaphorically. It's the uncertainty we face, the unknown that lurks around every corner of life, the knowledge that no matter how safe we feel, danger could emerge from anywhere. The entity's hunger is like time itself, inevitable and consuming, feeding on our experiences, our emotions, our very lives as they pass. But unlike the entity's survivors, we are not trapped in literal eternal cycles. Our struggles have meanings we define. Our cooperations can lead to genuine progress. Our hopes can be fulfilled rather than forever deferred. The horror of Dead by Daylight is compelling precisely because it takes real anxieties and amplifies them to mythological proportions, allowing us to confront them in pure, intense form. The survivors in the entity's realm endure because they must, because the entity wills it, because there is no alternative. We endure by choice, finding meaning and purpose in a universe that, unlike the entity's realm, is not actively designed to torment us, merely indifferent to our suffering. That indifference may be its own kind of cosmic horror, but it also means we have agency, possibility, the chance to build rather than merely survive. So rest now, having journeyed through the entire chronology of the entity's realm. The trials will continue without you, endless variations on eternal themes, killers hunting survivors through fog-shrouded realms, the entity feeding on their fear and hope. But you are outside it, an observer like the observer himself, aware of the whole design, understanding the mechanisms by which fictional horror operates. And in understanding, perhaps there is comfort. The entity is not real. The trials are not literal. The fears they represent are genuine, but they can be confronted, managed, integrated, rather than eternally fled from. Sleep well, listener. Tomorrow brings no trials, only the ordinary challenges of existence, which are difficult enough but far more surmountable than the cosmic horror of being trapped in an eternal game you cannot win. The fog dissolves. The realm fades. Rest comes.